NHS is building its own contact tracing app. Daphne Leprince-Ringuet was ZDNet here with me to talk about this. And Daphne, I understand that they're not building this on the model similar to Google or Apple. So talk a little bit about this announcement and why this is important.
So the NHS, as you said, is building a contact tracing app in order to track and trace people who have been in contact with potential carriers of COVID-19 or people who have been diagnosed or showing symptoms of the disease. They're building an app that will be based on Bluetooth, which means that as phones record proximity with other phones, if a user sort of reports feeling sick, it will trigger a cascade of warnings for other users to self-isolate or stay at home or even quarantine. In parallel to the announcement that the NHS was working on their app, Apple and Google also announced that they were putting forward a model for an API that they are jointly developing for developers to be able to easily build contact tracing apps over Bluetooth that will be compatible with iOS and with Android. So those two announcements sort of happened together. The NHS was not initially clear whether they would go with Google and Apple's model. They did say that the NHS was working with tech giants. They specifically named Apple and Google. And then eventually they came out saying that the NHS would not be using the API put forward by Apple and Google, but using its own independent model that will not be based on sort of the protocols that Apple and Google have been putting forward.
Yeah, and saying that along that same line, Daphne, it sounds like the decentralized models that Google and Apple use, that's not what the NHS is going with here. So talk a little bit about the type of model that they're proposing.
Yeah, exactly. So as you said, the model put forward by Apple and Google is decentralized, which means that the matching happens basically over users' phones and not, the data never goes through a central database. It's only happening on the phones. So each user has an anonymous key code that's exchanged whenever the phone sort of registers a prolonged contact with another user. And then without this key code ever going through a sort of central database, the other users are able to recognize and match with this key code if the first user then reports being ill. So the NHS is going for a different model in the sense that the warnings and the reports of being ill will go through a central database first, where the NHS will run analytics in order to determine who in the list of contacts needs to be warned and is really at risk of being infected. The reason for that is that with Bluetooth, there is a risk of false positives being registered. A Bluetooth signal could technically register a contact with someone who's, for example, on the other side of the road and who's not actually at risk of being infected. So the NHS wants to be able to run those analytics to target warnings accordingly and target them intelligently to people who are most at risk. The other advantage of a centralized database is that it would enable the NHS to also review the warnings before they're sent. So for example, if a user reports feeling ill but doesn't actually have COVID, the NHS would then be able to amend sort of the warning that has been issued as a result of that. They'd be able to identify fake reports, whether they are, as I said, because someone reported feeling ill and actually didn't have COVID, or if they have been issued with malicious intent for someone who wanted to sort of force a part of the population to stay home for various reasons. So the idea behind the centralized database is to be able to run those analytics and make sure that the app works in a smarter way, rather than the decentralized model where anyone can report feeling sick and just trigger this cascade of warnings to a whole set of users without really filtering through where the warnings are most needed.
Yeah, and Daphne, obviously there's got to be some other side to this in terms of what people are feeling and thinking about them going to a centralized model. Talk a little bit about some of the concerns that have been surrounding the announcement in terms of how they plan to do with this.
So as you said, the main concern is privacy. With all the data going through a central database, privacy experts have been raising their concerns about that, mostly because although the data will be anonymized, there is always a risk of de-anonymization. And if that was to happen, it would potentially be a way to track not only the proximity between people's phones, but also where people are going, how they're moving around the country. So there is a risk there. There is also a risk with how long data will be held after the pandemic has gone. So the sort of main warning that experts have raised has been to make sure that there are protocols in place to make sure that this data is sort of wiped out and stops being collected as soon as it's not necessary anymore. The NHS has provided reassurances. They have written extensively about how they will be protecting user privacy with this app. And they will continue to do so most likely, because the only way for the app to be taken up is if the general public actually trusts it. So it will be a key sort of communication message for the NHS in the weeks to come for the app to actually be successful in fighting back the spread of the pandemic.
Yeah, definitely have to have the public on board to understand and to buy into what's being done here. All right, Daphne, well, I know we have a great deal more information on the announcement there by the NHS, of course, in your article on ZDNet, and we hope you all will check it out. Thanks for watching.